Hey everyone, Benchy from BenchyTests, and this is totally the first time I've tried to film this. Totally haven't taken several attempts to get this right. But first up I want to apologise for taking a bit longer to make this video than the other ones. I've had a lot of problems with stress, anxiety and depression, etc. So I'm just trying to sort of take my time with it, not force myself to do too much. But yeah, anyway, today we're going to be testing this, which, if I can get the camera to focus, which it probably won't, is the Celeron G550, which was a Sandy Bridge based Celeron released on June 3rd, 2012. I remembered it. Yes, released on June 3rd, 2012, and it was a 2.6 GHz dual-core processor. And the interesting thing, I suppose it's not particularly interesting because a lot of other CPUs are like this, but one thing in particular about the Sandy Bridge Celerons is that they're basically Pentiums of the Sandy Bridge range. They just have a megabyte of L3 cache disabled, so 2 megabytes in total. There may very well be other differences. I'm not quite sure, but there probably is. But yeah, anyway, let's roll the intro. I said roll the intro. That's your cue. Roll the intro. What do you mean you didn't know it was your cue? We talked about this before the bloody video. 1 second. Get here. Get. Oh, don't hit me. Oh, you desk. You absolute desk. Well, that was a bit tougher than expected. Moving on. Celeron G550 for the 1155 socket probably isn't going to be people's first thought when it comes to older CPUs for gaming, but as you'll see later on, it does far better in one game in particular than I was expecting it to. The Sandy Bridge based CPU was built on a 32nm fabrication process and featured 504 million transistors, nearly double what the Celeron E3300 released nearly 3 years prior had. The G550 had 64 kilobytes of L1 cache per core, 256 kilobytes of L2 cache per core, and 2 megabytes of shared L3 cache, which, as I previously mentioned, was cut down from the 3 megabytes Sandy Bridge Pentiums had. Carried support for the PCI Express 2.0 spec as well as DDR3, with an official max supported speed of 1066 MHz, although it had no problem running the 1600 MHz RAM I used at full speed. As is common on Intel CPUs, it also has integrated graphics, although for the purposes of this video we really couldn't care less about that, as it's the performance of the processor itself we're testing today. It launched at a price of $52 US, which is equivalent to around $58 US in today's money. That's also around £45 or €53. It was picked up for only £1 at CEX here in the UK, a bargain for what it can offer, but it is however out of stock right now. You can currently, at the time of writing anyway, pick it up for only £3.59 on eBay UK, but if you're over in the US, it will set you back $4.90 on ebay.com. For the test today, all power saving options in the BIOS will be disabled to get the best performance possible at stock and with an overclock. And speaking of the tests, today we'll look at what sort of performance the G550 can offer in some relatively modern games, modern compared to the hardware usually tested on the channel, and also giving you a look at what sort of power draw you can expect from the 7-year-old Celeron. And first up is Cinebench R20, so let's fire into that. So, being the Celeron, it's never going to offer the best performance, but compared to Celerons from previous generations, the G550 actually fares quite well. The E3300 Celeron, for example, managed an average score across 3 runs of only 230 points, whereas with runs of 355, 354 and 352 points respectively, the G550 managed 353.67 points, an increase in score of 53.77% over the E3300. Not a bad gain in performance for only 3 years difference between the two. When it comes to overclocking with Sandy Bridge and Ivy Bridge CPUs, locked processors like the G550 are heavily limited as there is very little wiggle room in the base clock. That said, with a boost in base clock to 106 MHz, the max this motherboard will allow, the G550 went from 2.6 to 2.754 GHz. The power limits were set to a maximum in the BIOS settings, but with something as low powered as this, it's unlikely there will be much of a difference. With that said, the G550 is now capable of an average score of 376.67 points, an increase of 6.5% over stock clocks, and nearly 20% better than the E3300, even though that was overclocked just shy of 4 GHz, which shows just how much difference only a few years can make to performance. Next up is Firestrike Physics, which simulates physics operations in a gaming scenario. The test was run 3 times and an average score was taken from that. And at stock, the G550 managed a score of 2,282.33 points. Despite the small overclock, there was a reasonable improvement with 2,452.67 points, 7.46% up on stock clocks. For the games, GTA 5 is up first, running at 1080p on the lowest settings with 16x anisotropic filtering. Both tests struggled with micro stuttering and brief lockups throughout the city, and although the overclock did manage to improve on the stutter a little, it was by no means a big improvement. FPS here could manage to get into the high 30s at stock and managed the low 50s with the overclock, but that obviously can't make up for how bad the stutter is. It was far smoother out in the desert area with very little if any stutter noticeable here at all, apart from maybe the odd brief hitch. The same was true for the overclock as well, although that did have the occasional brief hitch as well. Overall, the G550 at stock clocks managed 37, 16 and 5 FPS for its average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates respectively, and had a lot of spikes in frame times of up to around 75 milliseconds throughout, and several more of around 120 to 240 milliseconds. The overclock pushed up figures a little to 41, 20 and 8 FPS for its average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates respectively, with several spikes in its frame times throughout the test reaching around 60 milliseconds, and a lot more reaching up to around 180, and a couple more of around 240 milliseconds. Rise of the Tomb Raider was a big surprise in the G550, as performance was actually far better than you would have expected it to be. The game ran surprisingly well at 1080p, using the lowest settings and 16x anisotropic filtering. At the start of the test, there were only a couple of stutters at stock, which dropped to around 25 FPS at the worst. Some of the character models would appear stuttery during combat, but despite that, performance so far was better than expected, the same being true for the overclock, which managed to fix those few stutters. The same couldn't be said for the rest of the game unfortunately, as stock clocks has issues at the Wolf Den and the Soviet installation, with the interior not rendering at all, although the overclock had no issue with this. The stutter throughout the Soviet installation at stock clocks was noticeable but relatively minor, which is surprising considering this is one of the harder to run parts of the game. The overclock on the other hand was again surprising here, with only the odd stutter occurring and not much else. The stuttering in the Copperville area though was pretty bad at times with stock clocks, with stock having major issues here. It smooths out in parts but overall performs pretty badly. The overclock was noticeably stuttery here too, but was an improvement over stock clocks to the point that it could still be played without too much discomfort. Stock clock showed for its average 1% and 0.1% lows, 46, 15 and 10 FPS respectively, with several spikes in frame times throughout the test, especially in the latter half of it, of up to around 100 to 120 milliseconds, more hitting 160 milliseconds and one of 320 milliseconds. The overclock, as mentioned, dealt with the stutter to an extent as the benchmark figures show, with average 1% and 0.1% lows of 49, 19 and 14 FPS respectively. There were again a lot of spikes in frame times, particularly in the latter half of the test, reaching around 110 milliseconds, more hitting around 130, a couple around the 180 to 230 milliseconds mark, and one reaching 380 milliseconds. Next is Csgo, released back in 2012, but still massively popular today. The stock clocks had noticeable issues with stuttering, especially when in close combat with multiple AI characters on screen. The overclock fixed some of this, but both tests suffered from pretty inconsistent frame times, stock clocks especially, which had a noticeably stuttery appearance throughout the test. The G550 managed a 71 FPS average at stock, with the overclock scoring 81 FPS here. Stock clocks had lows of 40 and 30 FPS for 1% and 0.1% lows respectively, which should make the game fine, but the frame time inconsistency prevents that. There were spikes in frame times of around 60 milliseconds, more up to 75 milliseconds and some as high as 100 to 120 milliseconds. 1% and 0.1% lows were a bit better for the overclock at 46 and 33 FPS respectively, and it was helped by less inconsistent frame times as well. It had spikes in frame times in the same ranges as stock did, however they weren't as frequent. And last up for the games today is Warframe, which tends to be fairly easy for older hardware to run. And it's no different with the G550, which managed to maintain playable levels of performance throughout both tests. Neither test dropped lower than 58 FPS, and stock clocks only had a couple of occasions of stutter, which the overclock managed to fix. Neither test showed any other issues throughout, and overall, the game ran great even at stock clocks. Stock clocks had average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 73, 43 and 35 FPS respectively, with only a few spikes in frame times around 40 to 60 milliseconds and one of 100 milliseconds. The overclock showed a reasonable improvement to average frame rates of 80 FPS, and a small boost in 1% and 0.1% lows of 47 and 38 FPS respectively, and only a few frame time spikes of around 40 to 60 milliseconds. The Celeron G550 isn't exactly a power-hungry CPU, and the fact that it can't overclock that much means the difference between stock clocks and the overclock is minimal. At idle, the G550 pulls 11.74 watts down the 8-pin power cable compared to the overclock's 11.98 watts, which is within the 3% error margin, so is effectively equal. Sandy Bridge R20 was the most power-hungry benchmark in the test, with 28.42 watts going down the 8-pin power cable at stock clocks, and 29.78 watts with the 2.754 GHz overclock, an increase of 4.79%, so outside of error. Firestrike Physics had the power draws for stock and the overclock within error of each other at 26.91 and 27.18 watts respectively down the 8-pin power cable, a difference of only 1% in power draw. So to conclude, the G550 performed surprisingly well today compared to my expectations of it. It was only 7.1% down on a 3.8 GHz Core 2 Duo E8300 and Cinebench R20, and in Rise of the Tomb Raider it managed to surprise me in that as well. That's not to say it was without its problems though. And because you can't overclock it that much, if you're wanting to build a dual core setup with old parts, you'd actually be better off looking at the higher end Core 2 Duos, as they overclock far better than the G550 can, but they do use a lot more power in comparison. Before we finish up today, I'd like to give shoutouts to Patreon supporters Tasfie Dodge and Shadow in the Void for helping to make all of this possible. If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a comment and a like, and subscribing to my channel if you'd like to see more content like this. Maybe even sharing the video with people you think may enjoy it. And although there's no obligation to do so, you can support me in creating these videos through my Patreon at patreon.com/benchygaming, or through Ko-fi at ko-fi.com/benchygaming. And if you do decide to become a patron, you'll gain early access to all of my videos for as long as you remain a patron. But thanks for watching my video. It means a lot that you would take the time to watch my content. Hopefully I'll see you in the next one.